I'm Martín Sánchez-Jankowski. I'm a professor of sociology and a co-chair of the Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues. Of course, named after Joe, who we have come here today to honor, particularly his legacy and contributions to the University of California over a number of years. I want to give a special welcome to Joe's family, and also express our condolences for their loss, and we'll actually have the pleasure to hear two of his children speak towards the end of the ceremony. I do want to acknowledge the people who helped to sponsor this event today: the Native American Studies program, the Ethnic Studies Department, Native American Student Development, American Indian Graduate Program, and the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. As many of you know, Anthony Hall is different than it was in the past, and I am very happy to say that it's now the home for Native American Community Center. And I think we're all happy about that, particularly those of us who have been identified with Native communities for most of our lives and are now part of this community. That is the whole university community. It's a pleasure to introduce all of our speakers today. So I won't go through over and over again, sound repetitious about saying what a pleasure it is. I want to acknowledge right from the start it's a pleasure. And so then I will actually be kind of efficient in fact, introducing each of our speakers today. The first speaker, of course, is the person who leads our campus, Chancellor Christ, who will give us a few remarks on behalf of the university and herself.
Thank you, Martín, and thanks to all of you who gathered here today to honor and celebrate the legacy, the contributions, and the life of Joseph A. Myers. Before proceeding, I wish to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. Muwekma Ohlone people are flourishing members of Berkeley and the broader Bay Area community today, and I extend a warm welcome to members who are with us here today. I recognize that members of the Berkeley community have benefited from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples, both historically and in the present. I'd like to begin by offering my sincere condolences to Joseph Myers' family, his widow Dixie, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, his brother Larry, and his cousins and other relations. I would also like to offer my condolences to his friends, colleagues, and former students. It's wonderful that so many of you are here with us today, a testament to the impact that Joseph has had on us all, on our community, and on our university. Despite his many accomplishments, Joseph Myers remained a humble person and invited everyone to call him Joe. That's how I knew him and how I will refer to him today. Joe was a lifelong Cal Bear, receiving his bachelor's degree in rhetoric in 1972 and his JD in 1975 from UC Berkeley, one of the first Californian Native Americans to achieve that level of academic accomplishment and recognition. He was a visionary leader, a powerful advocate, and a devoted teacher. For the last 30 years of his life, Joe generously passed on his wisdom and knowledge as a lecturer in Native American Studies, as a respected and admired teacher and mentor for many generations of Berkeley students. His service to the campus and its community went far beyond teaching and the classroom, and I know that others speaking today will say more about his varied and significant contributions. For my part, I'd like to focus on Joe's vital role as a member of UC Berkeley's NAGPRA Advisory Committee. In that capacity, he played a key role in changing an unfortunate institutional culture that supported, for far too long, our failure to comply fully with both the letter and spirit of NAGPRA. I can draw a direct line between Joe's efforts, values, and wisdom and where we are today with a new policy and practice of full compliance with NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA, with a new initiative underway to restore justice and forge respectful relations between the campus and Native American communities. Joe's ability to hold and balance commitments to both UC Berkeley and to California Native peoples enabled him to work collaboratively and constructively with the Phoebe Hearst Museum for more than a decade. We're so grateful that Joe was willing and able to work within the system to help the museum and the university improve and evolve, and to hold us accountable to the law, our values, and the public we serve. Now, as we accelerate and expand the repatriation of sacred ancestral remains and funerary objects to their rightful guardians, Joe's legacy is being made manifest. And with that, we hope will come the beginning of needed repairs to the relationship between Berkeley and the tribes in our state and across the country. Joe dedicated his life to bringing justice, empowerment, and hope to Native people, and his legacy endures through the lives he touched and the communities he served at the University of California, Berkeley, and far beyond.
Thank you, Chancellor Christ. Now it's my opportunity to introduce Shari Huhndorf, who will speak to us on behalf of Native American Studies program in the Ethnic Studies Department.
Good afternoon. I'm Shari Huhndorf. I'm Professor of Native American Studies here at UC Berkeley. I am also UPIC from Alaska and a visitor here on Ohlone lands. It's my privilege to represent Native American Studies and honoring the extraordinary legacy of Joe Myers. Among the most striking dimensions of Joe Myers' legacy is the incredible range of his contributions to Indian country. His work on social justice for Native communities began when he was a young person and continued throughout his life. After graduating from Berkeley Law, he created a tribal court training program and eventually founded the National Indian Justice Center. He brought a successful lawsuit against the Bureau of Indian Affairs to reinstate the tribal status of 17 California Indian nations. He founded the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center. The list goes on. What unites these endeavors is an enduring commitment to justice for individual Native people and the communities they come from, and to creating visibility and respect for Native California tribes. To accomplish these goals, Joe Myers turned social institutions that have historically been used against Native communities into tools of empowerment for Native people. He brought these same commitments to his work on our campus. In Native American Studies, Joe Myers was Professor Myers. For nearly 3 decades, he served as faculty in the Native American Studies program, as mentor to generations of students, and as visionary in the only research center on campus dedicated to Native issues. He taught courses in tribal governments and Native law, educating his students about Native sovereignty and giving them tools to support their own tribal governments. Beyond his own classes, he gave up his time and expertise to develop a course on Native California, which is still offered every year in our department and should be required of all students at the university. In these ways, he transformed our curriculum into an instrument of social justice that he fought for throughout his life. His students revered him. They described him as wise, inspirational, deeply knowledgeable, and passionate about his subjects. They praised his classes for educating them about critical issues in Indian country that encompass sovereignty, tribal courts, treaties, water rights, violence against Indigenous women, and land rights. His students also appreciated his sense of humor and his skill at keeping them engaged. To these students, he was not only a teacher, but also a devoted mentor. Each year, he served as MC at the campus-wide Native graduation. His presence showed his pride in our students' accomplishments and his support for their aspirations. Joe was also known for bringing levity and humor to the ceremony. He made the students and their families feel welcome at Berkeley, and he made graduation a proud and joyous occasion. Graduate students found and still find the same level of support at the Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues, so named because of Joe's many contributions to our campus. There, students find intellectual community and support, along with a sense of belonging. As mentor to many Native graduate students over the decade that I have been at Berkeley, I can attest that the center has been crucial to the work of retaining Native graduate students and ensuring their success. To honor Joe Myers' service to the university, Native California, and Indian country, Native American Studies has joined with other units on campus, including the Myers Center, to establish the Joseph A. Myers Award for Service to Native Communities. The award recognizes individuals who have substantially contributed to Native communities or organizations, especially those in Native California. It is open to students and postdoctoral scholars at UC Berkeley, as well as individuals who are unaffiliated with our campus. We will solicit nominations in early 2022, and the first Myers Award will be announced at Native graduation next spring. We are grieved by Joe Myers' passing, and all of us, including our students, will miss him deeply. But he left the university a better place, a place for learning about tribal issues, especially as they relate to California, and for turning education into a tool for sustaining Native cultures and tribal sovereignty. His legacy calls upon us to continue that work. On behalf of Native American Studies, I convey our deepest respect and condolences to members of Joe Myers' family and community. Koyana.
Commuted to our campus to offer a class. And as you can imagine, as already been said, there have been many students who took his class. Well, we're happy to have one of them here today to tell us what it was like to be in Joe's class. And so I invite Christina Tlatilpa, and I hope I haven't mispronounced your name. I'm sorry if I have. Inong, who's program specialist at the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, to come up and speak to us.
So hi everyone, Piali. My name is Christina Tlatilpa Inong. I was fortunate to have been a student of Joseph Myers during the completion of my Master of Social Welfare program here at UC Berkeley. It was the spring of 2016 when I took his Native American Tribal Governments class during the first year of my program. I was super excited to have been able to find a class that connected Native issues to my field, as I had noticed that there was a major lack of Indigenous perspectives within the curriculum that I was learning through my department. As I found out how I could integrate the class as part of my studies, fellow social welfare classmates decided to also take the course to enrich their studies outside of our department. As I sat in class with my close friend during the first day, we were excited to see a Native class led by Native professors. Both Professor Myers and his daughter Nicole set straight to work on day one and emphasized that the content of the class was going to be intensive, but ultimately the information covered would be vital in understanding tribal governments, Native perspectives, and learning how to address issues that tribal communities experience. From that day forward, it was evident that Professor Myers not only had extensive background and experience in the world of justice in Indian country, but also an immense passion and dedication to benefiting tribal communities across the nation. Some of the distinct memories I think about when it comes to the course was the interplay of teaching between Professor Myers and Nikki. Their flow between teaching intense history and material with the integration of humor, like Carmen mentioned, always kept us students engaged in the class, and I always looked forward to attending it. Even though it was once a week for 3 hours long, that was my favorite class probably of my entire 2 years here during my master's program. Even more so, I was excited to be able to share material that I learned in class with Joe and Nikki back with our department, and I distinctly remember bringing up materials from that particular class to benefit the learning of fellow classmates in social welfare, especially when it came to understanding the importance and significance of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Post taking the class, I was fortunate enough to have been hired to work for both CIMCC and NIJC, two amazing organizations that Joe founded with the vision of making positive impacts across different fields for Native communities. Working for both organizations has been a blessing, and I feel lucky to be surrounded by the legacy that Joe left with his family. Working in a place where everyone is passionate for advocating and addressing the needs of Native communities. I will always remember the love that everyone had for Joe, as he often had visitors spend time with him or people call to ask him how he was doing. Carmen, I know I always heard your voice on the phone like at least once a week. Even recently at an NIJC training that we conducted for ICWA sessions, somebody did share that if it wasn't for Joe's mentorship, they wouldn't have been in the world of advocacy for so many years, and that they're still doing that work today, and that Joe's memory honored the work that they did moving forward. And I just want to end by saying that it continues to be truly evident that the love that Joe had for his community is alive and present, and it continues to live in the lives of so many today. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Karen Biestman, who has also been on this campus for a very, very long time, both as a student, a graduate student in law school, and actually was part of our community of get-togethers that Joe and I had for some time. She's currently the Associate Dean and Director of Native American Culture Center at Stanford.
Thank you, Martín. I'm honored to join you today to celebrate Joe's life. Joe Myers is a giant of a man. At least that was my first impression when, over 40 years ago, I sat across a conference table from him at the American Indian Lawyer Training Program office in Oakland, talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act. I was then a humble UC Berkeley undergraduate intern, and he was the larger-than-life assistant director of ALTIC. I remember his large hands on a table, and his large head covered by thick blasts of dark hair. His presence was commanding, and his reputation as a police officer turned social justice champion and fearless sovereignty advocate was formidable. For those of you outside of federal Indian law circles, Joe was one of the few young indigenous lawyers who were on the front lines reclaiming the word Indian in federal Indian law. Not so much a renaissance, but a true revolution, a defining era, and Joe was the driving force. But when he spoke, it was measured, inclusive, and welcoming. He turned to me, the youngest and least skilled at the table, and said, "Judge Karen, if this were your court, what would you do?" Horrified and humbled, I somehow summoned a response. And at that moment, a lasting appreciation to learn by doing. Decades later at Cal and at Stanford, where I also teach in Native American Studies, also the law school and the Stanford Design School, and in higher education beyond, we prioritize experiential or integrative learning models. But Joe has been practicing it for decades, giving young scholars and leaders agency to own knowledge through experience and work together to resolve conflicts. This is real learning. Joe's footprint in Indian country is vast. As the executive director of the National Indian Justice Center, which he created after ALTIP, his vision for indigenous excellence paved the way for tribes to realize self-determination. The education and training, publications, conferences, consultations, and national advocacy aligned at a time in history where opportunities and need truly coincided. Joe was there to shape a national conversation, calls to action, professional training of the highest quality, and platforms for exchanging best practices, including for conflict resolution. His All My Relations conferences, I see some attendees in the room, brought hundreds together, including Indian youth, to learn together, celebrate the strength of our families and communities, and build strong alliances. He is a bridge builder and a healer. And true to his character as a transformational learning pioneer, Joe returned to teaching in Native American Studies and established the Joseph Myers Institute for Native American Research, as you just heard about, further cementing California's flagship institution as a place for Native students and others to immerse themselves in research and create social change. His name with the Institute guarantees scholarly and community excellence and has been a draw for generations. My own son Ross, also a Cal grad, was exposed to Indian law all his life at the kitchen table, but it wasn't until he took a course from Joe and daughter Kelly, that he came bounding home and fully appreciated the value and depth of tribal sovereignty. Thanks again, Kelly. That Joe was selected for the annual Peter Haas Public Service Award at Berkeley, the first Native to be so honored, reflected how deeply his career and life of service impacted the UC community, the nation, and the world. At the awards ceremony, presided over by Chancellor Robert Bergeneau, himself also a First Nations Canadian Métis ancestry, Joe told his story of being a tired child who was carried on his Pomo grandfather's back, and that he remembers the closeness, the skin-to-skin experience of hearing his grandfather's heartbeat, a metaphor he likened to the mandate for tribal persistence and cultural continuity. Joe lived that mandate, touching many lives at Cal and beyond, consistently enriching our understanding, but also grounding us in common human values of respect, compassion, and trust. And lastly, it was in the museum world that I have worked most closely with Joe in the last 20 years, serving as board vice chair along his board chair role in the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center. Joe is a masterful storyteller with a keen memory and fancy for humor. Telling the California Indian story from a Native perspective was a perfect venue for him. His lived experience, including survivance, Cal Emeritus Gerald Visner's word for indigenous imaginative survival through wit and grit and grace and a little bit of chance, resonated in the stories of California Indian artists and storytellers and musicians, community leaders, food preparers, healers, and beyond. In this venture, Joe's daughter, Nicole Lim, ably leads the museum as a highly skilled director. But Joe, as ambassador and advocate, breathed life into it, and the rest of us were beneficiaries. That giant of a man whose bold vision seized key moments of legal and social change and innovative research to advance and uplift Indian country, who healed families and communities, who inspired generations of students, who created a world-class museum to tell the California Indian story through Native eyes. At the end, I remember best as a treasured friend. A man who was true to his own moral compass, honest, compassionate, generous, funny, and kind. A mentor, thought partner, and trusted confidant. I miss his grin, his incessant teasing. If you've been on the end of that, you know what I mean. And his drive to serve. My heart goes out to his loving family, including wife Dixie, the anchor of the family, his children and grandchildren whose loss is immeasurable. But thanks to the leadership of Kelly at the Justice Center and Nikki at the museum, and the traditions carried on by his grandchildren, including Ben Myers, a Stanford undergraduate and UCLA law alum, and my goddaughter, Jaden Lim, a Stanford undergraduate, both of whom I've enjoyed working with, blessed to work with for many years. Joe's legacy is in good hands. Anchored by Dixie, the Myers family is a uniquely vibrant, generous, and substantive clan of people and four-leggeds. They are strong. Friends like me will continue to share his teaching and his wisdom and try humbly to replicate the largesse of his heart. I love you, Joe.
Joe was the proud father of 7 children, 2 of whom are here today to share their thoughts. Both of whom are Cal alums and worked closely with Joe, both in terms of his work in various sites in Indian country, as well as teaching here. One is Raquelle Myers, who we affectionately, Joe first affectionately, and then passed on to the rest of us, referred to as Kelly. And the other is Nicole Myers-Lim, who we also, Joe let us know affectionately, and we affectionately refer to as Nikki. I guess Kelly will ask you to come forward first.
So I saw that I was going to have to speak after Karen, so I brought a poem by Maya Angelou. That's the only way I could follow up after Karen. I wasn't quite sure I'd be able to talk very much without the tears going. We haven't quite gotten past that stage yet. But I think it's important for you all to know how much my dad loved this campus. I had a unique opportunity as a child to go with him to class up at the law school. And if you haven't met my dad or haven't thought about it for a while, he's a big man. Karen's right, he's a giant of a man. And I was never much bigger than that when we were walking on campus. And he had a long stride, and it was my job to keep up. The stairs at Wheeler for a young kid, I'll never forget them. But what I saw was how energized he was and how he prepared and how diligent he was about his studies. He understood the opportunities that he had when he came to this campus. When I got to go to campus with him, he made me study as well. And he told me I had to be prepared. You never knew if the professor was going to call on you. And I was a little cynical as a kid, hasn't changed much as an adult. And I did what he said. I listened to what he told me. We had a long car ride from Petaluma to Berkeley. He never once complained about that. I complained affectionately, and I used to tease him and say, the only reason I'm here teaching with you when he was lecturing is I'm the extra body for the car lane, right? So one of these opportunities that I had as a kid to go with him up to the law school, the professor did call on me. And I kind of looked at my dad, and my dad just gave me a nod, and I gave the answer. And I don't really remember the question. I only know that I got it right because the professor nodded his head. My dad had a big grin, that grin that Karen misses. He wasn't really looking at me, he was looking at the professor like, told you. So just know from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of my family, how much he loved this campus and how much he got from you, from his colleagues, from the students. We'll be forever thankful for that. And for those times at graduation, I can tell you how much he loved going to graduation. And it was important to him that the students understand that the class, even once it was let out, that he was still there for them. He had written many, many letters of recommendation for schools, law schools in particular. And he was always so happy to hear back from the students, hear about their journey. Whether or not they went to law school didn't matter, but I will tell you there was one that made it to Harvard, and he had a big grin that day. He had one of his students came back and told him how thankful he was for their recommendation letter. Okay, so let me see if I can get through this. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, and sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Our souls dependent upon their nurture now shrink, wizened. Our minds formed and informed by their radiance fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when gray souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses, restored, never to be the same, whispered to us, they existed. They existed. We can be better. For they existed. And with each one of you, I think you'll help us make sure that his existence is always meaningful. We have a great, big shoes to fill, and maybe all of us together can do that.
Wow, they say time heals, but I'm waiting still. It's very difficult. My dad believed in the power of education to change lives, and it changed his. But because it changed his, it also changed ours. Education definitely is a means to raise Native people out of poverty, but I think what he was more concerned with is not economic poverty, but poverty of the mind. And Berkeley opened so many opportunities, and being here and teaching, I recently was fortunate enough to be hired to teach his class, and every time, even though it's so hard to do it without him, every time I leave the class, I feel really good. I'm really excited. I have a college student who sometimes, and a teenager, and I don't always feel like they're real interested in what I have to say. They're usually on their phones. But when I have a class full of 40 students who want to know what I have to say, it's an ego boost. So I get it, Dad. But he believed in education and the power of it, and he was raised by his grandparents, and they instilled that in him, and they instilled that as a means of resiliency. They knew that was the opportunity for him to make change for our family and our community. But he really changed the lives of his students. And I wanted to read you, we got a lot of outpouring of support from folks. But I wanted to read you a letter that one of his students sent me. And he said, his name's Rex, and he said, "Hello, Nikki. I wanted to reach out to you to offer my sincere condolences on the passing of your father. I had the sudden urge to check in on his whereabouts this morning, and I was saddened to learn the news from the research center that he co-founded at Berkeley. While 2020 was a challenging year for many in one way or another with the pandemic, I cannot fathom what you and your family have been put through to lose a loved one during this already tumultuous time. When I took you and your father's class in fall 2016, I was struck by the genuine interest that you and your father had in ensuring that students understood the unique and complex history of Native American people, the legal system, and case law. Most professors that I came across during my time at Berkeley did not seem interested in the classes or students they taught. There was a certain ego that some professors had to complement this. However, your father was a very down-to-earth person, despite his accomplishments and how parts of the subject matter that you taught negatively affected your community on a deeply personal level. His vast knowledge kept me attentive, while his wry sense of humor kept me entertained during the weekly 3-hour lectures, which is easier said than done during such long class sessions. He was very approachable and always willing to explain various legal concepts to me, even if they didn't relate to your class. As somebody who wore sweatpants every day in college and even got in trouble for wearing them to work, I really enjoyed your father's sense of style. We both understood the benefits of comfortable fashion, and the rest of the world will catch up one of these days. In which case, your father will deserve props for being a trendsetter. While the work your father did was important, the most important thing in my eyes is that your father was a genuinely kind human being. This is a trait that many people lack nowadays, and it's a shame that we now have one less person like him for our future generations to learn from. I hope you and the rest of your family are able to find comfort during these difficult times. The work you continue doing for the museum and spreading the kindness you also possess in a touching way to honor your father's legacy helps ensure that he will never be forgotten. I will stay tuned for news of any memorial service hosted by the Research Center and would love to attend if there's a Zoom option. I wish you all the best new year, and please continue to remain safe. So I really think that letter is very evident in what type of educator he was, and how much he meant to people. And he really made people feel like they were capable of achieving their dreams. And, he expected that of us. And so, these last couple of years, he really struggled to come to campus. He really struggled to teach, but it was so important to him. He loved it. He stubbornly went across Sproul Plaza with a cane, and insisted on carrying the bag, but he wanted to be here. He wanted that interaction. And for me, it was a really critical time because it was one day a week that I got to spend with him. Hours in traffic, listening to MSNBC, complaining about Donald Trump the whole way back. He used to tell us different moments he had on campus over the years. One of them that was a highlight was when he was a student and he talked about storming the Chancellor's office and demanding more money for ethnic studies. And he was surprised because the Chancellor responded, "How much do you need?" And he was really ready for some activism, and he didn't get that satisfaction. But the other proud moment was him and who we call our Uncle Bill Johnson, the chief of the Umatilla Tribal Court. And that was during the Ishi Centennial. And we were up at the I House, and they were trying to decide how to open. And they always got funny ideas between the two of them. And so they decided that Uncle Bill should do a war whoop and wage war on all the anthropologists in there. And they really got huge satisfaction on seeing the anthropologists' reaction to the war whoop. So I think that, and sometimes my dad was criticized for this, but he understood that lasting change comes from within. And he was really dedicated to building infrastructure and changing this university. And there's so many resources for California Indian people here that change eventually will make this university the forefront of research and cultural revitalization. The materials are here. We need the California Indian expertise to implement it. And I see that as what's going to come. And I think that, one thing that I think about, and we talked about when he passed, were ancestral bear trails. And we've recently been studying the bears, and the brown bears are emerging back in Sonoma County and helping us understand our food sovereignty and revitalization. But the bears make ancestral trails. And even though they're different species of bears, the other bears that come behind follow those same footprints. And so, my dad, he created that ancestral bear trail here at Cal. And it's a legacy that we'll continue to have. And those baby bears are gonna walk in those footsteps and always have a home here. And so, we just really appreciate you all coming and supporting him. And as you can imagine, it's an immeasurable loss. But he mentored us, every day, driving in the car, every day going to class. He mentored us to continue that work and be strong and make him proud. And that's what we'll do. Thank you.
For myself, on a personal note, as some of you probably would know, he was a colleague of mine as a centerist but he was also my friend. So if I were given the opportunity to go back to my own roots, which is to be raised in a very traditional Native community with certain kinds of ideas about this event that we have. I'd share them with you, with Dixie, and of course with Kelly and Nikki. And I'd say, and I'm going to have to a little bit translate them, and it may come out a little bit awkward because I learned them in my first language. And but there are 4 events like this. And it's sort of similar to Carmen's. And if he were here and it was about somebody else, I could just imagine him saying to me, as when we had conversations, him shaking his head, saying nothing, but getting it. We, from my tribe, and I'm thinking of other Native tribes, believe he traveled to the spiritual world. And in that world strengthens us, sustains us in our life now. And we're grateful. And we're grateful. So let us now all be grateful and go forward with the life that he helps sustain us. Okay, and now it's the reception will follow. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.